Welcome, friends, to this first lecture in our course, The Introduction to the Quran. In this lecture, we're going to look at the Quran as a book, as a text, and we'll do so in 3 steps. First, we'll look at its general qualities as a text. Then we'll look into its division into chapters, or according to the Arabic Islamic term, surahs, and we'll say some things about those surahs, or those chapters. And then we'll look finally at the division of those surahs into verses. But let's begin by looking generally at the text. Friends, the Quran is a relatively short book. It's about 2/3 the size of the New Testament, and in all it has 77,000 words, more or less. And although there are different ways of counting these things precisely, about 6,236 verses. We've already mentioned it's divided into chapters, or surahs, and there are 114 of these surahs in the Quran. The first surah, known as Al-Fatiha, or, according to the English translation, the opening, is only 7 verses. It seems to be placed at the opening of the Quran as something like an introductory prayer. The next surah, Al-Baqarah, or the cow, is the longest in the Quran, with 286 verses. The shortest surah is not the last, but rather surah 108, Al-Kawthar, which has just 3 verses and 10 words. Let's examine these surahs, or these chapters, more closely. Already we have a hint that these surahs move in a progression from longer to shorter. The longest one, as we've mentioned, is surah 2, and they continue to proceed in declining order, more or less. There are some exceptions, and we'll get back to those exceptions because they tell us something interesting about the historical development of the Quranic text. But there's something else we should say about the surahs. A couple of things about what they're not. The surahs do not proceed chronologically. And I mean this in 2 ways. They do not proceed chronologically according to, for example, the history of the world in the way that the Bible does. The Bible, of course, begins with Genesis, and it proceeds through a history of the prophets and the people of Israel all the way, according to the Christian Bible, through the New Testament to the book of Revelation, which is the end of time. The surahs don't proceed in that way. They also don't proceed chronologically according to the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims believe the Quran was all revealed by God to Muhammad, but the surahs are not in the order of their revelation. So there's no historical chronology, and there's also no chronology according to the Prophet Muhammad's life. In addition, individual surahs are not organized according to certain themes. By this I mean, Surah 2, for example, isn't dedicated according to one particular topic, say God, or faith, or fasting, or marriage and divorce. Surah 3 is not dedicated to one particular topic. In fact, Surah 3 is a good place to draw an example of the heterogeneous or mixed contents of any particular Quranic surah. Surah 3 begins, for example, in the first 32 verses by discussing God, revelation, and life after death. It proceeds then by turning to, rather abruptly, Mary, Jesus, and Christian teaching, then Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and a discussion of the true religion. It then turns again rather abruptly to warnings to Muslims to practice virtue. It discusses then plots of enemies against the believers, God's support of the believers in distress, the fate of the martyrs, and then it moves to a polemic against unbelievers. And then finally, in the last 11 verses, it speaks of the signs of God in nature and promises of heaven and the threat of hell. We could see then that this surah moves from one topic to another and sometimes shifts rather abruptly. And this is rather typical of all of the chapters of surahs of the Quran. They are heterogeneous or mixed in their contents. All of this raises an interesting question. The nature of these surahs, that is, the fact that they move from one topic to another, raises a question of whether the surahs were originally unified or rather composite. And here's what I mean. Were they unified in the sense that there's one authorial voice, one voice which can be detected throughout a whole surah? Were these surahs meant to be one composition, one unified composition? Or were they composite, perhaps a number of different pieces brought together by an editor or a reactor? The frequent shift in topic suggests that the latter scenario, that they're composite, may be more likely. It could be that the Quran has been preserved in a state of rough editing, that is, various pieces were put together and kept without a lot of editing or redacting to smooth the seams between these different pieces. Now, Muslims traditionally, of course, would object to this and would say the Quran's style, in fact, is distinctive And it's true it moves from one topic to another, sometimes abruptly, but that is one of its virtues. Just to give one example of this objection that's been raised by traditional or pious Muslims, Muhammad Asad, a famous translator of the Quran, writes, where the believer reading the Quran in Arabic sees beauty, the non-Muslim reader often claims to discern crudeness. For Asad, there's no crudeness in the way the Quran moves rapidly from one topic to another, but rather it's part of its genius, part of its distinctive style that makes it unlike any other book. We might also note that a number of surahs have certain formulas or formulaic ways of opening and ending, certain turns of phrase that we find at the beginning of surahs and at the end. And those turns of phrase, which seem to be, as we've mentioned, formulaic, suggest that there was an interest in writing surahs as a unified work. We see this, for example, in Quran 56, one of the surahs that we are reading for this section of the course, which begins with a calling to mind of the Day of Judgment and closes with an exhortation to praise God. Thus, we have, in a sense, conflicting evidence. Part of the evidence suggests that the surahs are composite, but another part of the evidence suggests that they're unified compositions. This remains an open question. Why don't we move on to another feature of the surahs, namely their titles? This is an interesting point. The titles do not appear in the earliest manuscripts of the Quran. But today, if you read any edition or any translation of the Quran, you'll find a title at the header of them. Now, Western scholars, when referring to the 114 surahs of the Quran, usually do by number. For example, if we were to refer to the famous throne verse in the Quran, which is Quran verse 255 of the second surah, a Western scholar would say, to get to the throne verse, turn to Surah 2, verse 255. But a Muslim scholar traditionally would refer to that surah by its title, as we've already mentioned, maybe you can remember, Al-Baqarah, or the cow. And traditionally, a Muslim scholar wouldn't even name the number of the verse, but would simply recite the first few words of that verse in Arabic. So instead of saying, turn to Quran 2, 255, a traditional Muslim scholar would say, turn to Al-Baqarah, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayy al-qayyum. The titles, in any case, we might note, are not taken from the first word of the surah, the way we find for some biblical books. For example, in Hebrew, the book of Genesis is known as Bereshit, which is the way that the book of Genesis begins in its original Hebrew language. The surah titles also do not reflect the contents of a surah. For example, Quran chapter 2 is called the cow, but it's not about a cow or cows. But the name or the word cow does appear therein. In Quran chapter 2, between verses 67 and 73, we have a reference to a biblical tradition that we know from Numbers 19 in Deuteronomy 21, which involves a cow. Now, what seems to have happened with these titles is that Muslim scholars traditionally chose one word or one element of a surah which was distinctive, so that they could use that word to be something like a label for the surah, so it would be easy to refer to it. And they do not imply this title, that the subject of those surahs reflects anything by the title. Let's return then to this important question of the order of the surahs. We've already mentioned that the surahs of the Quran, they tend to move from longer to shorter. But there are important cases where this general order is interrupted. We've seen already that Al-Fatiha, or the first surah of the Quran, is an exception. It's only 7 verses. We've mentioned that seems to be something of a prayer, which may explain why it's at the beginning of the Quran, even though it's so short, even though it precedes these longer surahs. But there are other exceptions. One type of exception is especially interesting to us. Let me give this an example of Surah 16. Surah 16, it's much longer than the surahs that precede it immediately, surahs 13 to 15. And the length of the surah is an exception, of course, because it should be shorter than what comes before it. However, we note that surahs 13, 14, 15, and 16, at the very beginning, have certain letters, Alif, Lam, Ra, A-L-R, if we were to translate these letters into English letters. And we have this sense that we have something of a group, that all of these surahs were grouped together, even though that grouping of the surahs seems to interrupt the larger principle of ordering of the Quran. And it could be that group of surahs was already something of a corpus or a body of text before the final redaction or composition of the Quran, in that it was inserted together and not interrupted. In other words, these letters that we find seem to be labels of these groupings of individual packets of surahs. Another example, just to give one more, is verses 41 to 46, which all begin with the letters Ha-Mim, even though, again, we have an interruption of the larger order. Surah 40 is longer than Surah 39, but it seems to have been kept with Surahs 41 to 46 because it has those letters and presumably was something like a packet of text that was inserted all together into the Quran when it was finally composed. One other point about the order of the surahs, which is important, we find that this general principle of ordering the surahs from longer to shorter is not novel, is not an innovation of the Quran, but follows what we find in the New Testament. The letters of Paul are organized from longer to shorter, from Romans the longest to Philemon the shortest. And in both cases, we can detect that this ordering presumably was a question of arranging a book in a way that would be useful for public recitation. When you have a book that's ordered from longer units to shorter units, it's easier to find a particular unit or a particular chapter, or in the case of the Quran, the particular surah that you want to read from. In other words, this ordering of the Quranic surahs, like that of the letters of Paul, reflects a fact that the book was originally intended for public, maybe liturgical, or ritual recitation. Finally, friends, let's turn to the smallest unit of the Quran, which is its verses. Like the Bible, the Quran is divided among its chapters into individual verses. And an important point about the verses, which we'll discuss in a later lecture, is that no matter their length, whether they're short or long, the verses tend to rhyme with their last words. This rhyming gives us a sense that the Quran was originally composed with verses in mind, that the verses are something not created artificially by dividing or chopping up the text, but rather originally the author of the Quran composed the text in rhyming individual units. Why don't we look at one example of this Quranic rhyme, or the way the verses all end with the same rhyming sound, with Quran 56, which is a passage we've read for this section. The first three verses read, إِذَا وَقَعَتِ الْوَاقِعَةِ لَيْسَ لِلْوَقَعَتِهَا كَاذِبَةٌ خَافِضَةٌ رَافِعَةٌ. We know, in other words, that these verses have come to an end because of the sound we hear at the end, which is what I mean by saying that the verses are organic units, original units with which the Quran was composed. So, friends, in our brief examination of the Quran as a book, we've begun with its overall qualities as a text. We've turned to the surahs, or the chapters, the 114 chapters of the book, and looked at some of their qualities, including their internal makeup, but also their titles and their larger order. And finally, we've turned to verses and noted the fact that they tend, in the overwhelming majority of cases, to rhyme. With this, we can move on in our next lecture to examine more the relationship of the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad.